Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
At this point, we go around and say our names, and I ask a question. And the speaker has usually helped me select the question. Today's question is, what is a major turn-on for you? So, we're asking you to be as specific as possible and also as brief as possible. So your name and what is a major turn-on for you. My name is Bob, and I think going from London to Paris on the Channel just for the day, some glamour adventure.
My name is Larry, my kid.
Which one?
My name is Terry, and
my name is CJ. I'd say getting off the plane at 3 in the morning in bomb bed.
Baruch, I'll pass.
My name is Patrick. A major turn on, just being around honest people.
Excuse me, I'm Milam. Really enjoying this kind of weather.
I'm Darren, and smartness.
I'm Michael. Tenderness.
I'm Kay. Chocolate.
I'm Larry. The model answer, personality. My answer, good look.
I'm Marshall. Green oil paint.
My name's Tom. Huge waves.
I'm Paul. Intimacy. I'm Arthur. Dancing.
I'm Cass, mascara.
I'm Peter. I also like dancing.
I'm Dean, the ocean.
I'm Don, and I think it's all kinds of ways of relating to men.
I'm Ray, and I'm fascinated by men, their bodies, and their psyches.
I'm Bill. A major turn on for me is singing with my chorus.
I'm Jim. I'll pass.
I'm Jim, and I like kissing.
I'm Clint, and Mount Campbell mushrooms.
Well, seeing a great play.
Rod. Minor turn-ons.
Craig and Tom.
I'm Tom, the man that might be at left.
I'm Michael.
I'm David, the ocean.
I'm Steve, New York City.
Mark, Santa Clarita Beach.
I'm Lee, the excitement of romance.
I'm Roger, the mind of clear light on the days that I be contacted.
Thanks. So Peter Washburn is our speaker today. He received his undergraduate and medical degrees from the University of Pennsylvania. He completed his residency training in internal medicine in the Navy, where he first got involved some 30 years ago in what is now called addiction medicine. He completed a 2-year fellowship in substance abuse at the San Francisco Veterans Administration Medical Center and currently works for Kaiser SF in its Chemical Dependency Recovery Program. Peter has been a member of GBF for the last 10 years. He just resigned after many years of service on the steering committee. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Sangha for your service on the steering committee. His talk is not strictly a Dharma talk, but rather a user-friendly review of current thinking regarding the medical scientific model of addiction. Peter?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, also somewhat daunting to give the talk that I've set for myself. It's way more about addiction than it is about Buddhism, but in a line that everything is attached to everything or connected to everything, this talk will be suitable. I think the series that we are in the midst of giving has been, for me, very rich and making all kinds of mental connections as I hear different speakers, and I hope that this does the same thing. What I thought I would do is talk a few minutes about various models of addiction, and then pick my own one where my bias is, that is the medical model, tell you a little bit about what we mean by that and what the current understanding is. To help with that, there's a handout from the Harvard Mental Health Letter. This is written in lay language, and it was a year or so ago, The Addicted Brain. So if I get sidetracked or we don't get to this or whatever it is, there's plenty of these for the taking. And then finally, something about therapy or recovery. And here the science is somewhat lacking, so I'm not going to be saying too much about that. And in fact, that's the opening for, I think, more concepts that are consistent or Buddhism oriented. I graduated from medical school in 1969, and a war was going on then as well, but there was a draft, and I would have been ripe fodder for getting drafted. Here I am as a physician, and of course I could have always, checked that little box on the form about homosexual tendencies, and that might have gotten me out. But at that time, I would rather have risked getting killed in Vietnam than be, exposed as a homosexual. So they made an arrangement. I had seen a resident, an orthopedic resident, drafted out of his residency when we were in medical school. He was in the anatomy lab with us, learning about the tendons and stuff in the arms and the legs. And suddenly one day he said, I'm not going to be here in a couple of weeks. He in 2 weeks had to radically change his life and pack up things and enter the service. So the military had this deal with physicians that you could agree to go in, but you had some degree of control as to when that would happen. So I said, okay, give me 2 years to get some training in internal medicine, and then I'll agree to go in. In the Navy, we picked the Navy, well, there's that romance about sailors and all. But also, what I said publicly was, the Navy had the reputation of having the best medical service, and you were always guaranteed a dry cot, they said, unlike the Army or the Marines. So I went into the Navy as an officer. You got to live off base in your own home. You didn't have to live in a barracks. I was afraid about this, the movies I'd seen in the 60s, barracks life and so forth. I couldn't pull that off. The swearing and the hard drinking and it's like locker room play. I couldn't do that. So I was wound up being stationed in rural Maryland at a small naval hospital, and most of the people I took care of were the Navy dependents, the wives, children, retirees. And I had this kind of small internal medicine clinic, and I was seeing one of my patients, a woman in her 30s or so. She had a medical problem which was stable, and there wasn't much to do medically, and she said, I think there's something about me you ought to know. Okay. She says, I'm a recovering alcoholic. Now, this is like 1971, 72. I have no idea what that meant. This is way before Betty Ford and that sort of thing. I think I just sat there with my mouth open a little bit. She says, I think that it's important that my physician know that, and I suspect you didn't. And she told me a little bit of her story. Well, I still kind of didn't. I knew what alcoholics were. By the way, 4 years of medical school and 2 years of training had taught me virtually nothing about the disease of alcoholism. We'll get back to that disease thing again. I saw I had encountered alcoholics, but where did they come from? Who were these people? We didn't know. And like I said, my formal training had not addressed that at all. So here was a woman telling me something that I knew virtually nothing about. And she suggested, I think she sensed an openness in me. At least I don't think completely closed off. She said, if you want to learn more, go to an AA meeting sometime. Well, that did make me step back. I'm not alcoholic. And that wasn't her point. So I filed that away. And about a year or so later, I was on duty in the hospital one night. And it was a quiet night, and there wasn't much going on. I was standing by the elevators kind of waiting, where was I going to do? And I happened to notice this little notice board, and it said there was an AA meeting in the chapel at 7 o'clock. I said, why don't I go? This idea had been planted a year earlier. So I went to this meeting. I was a little late, and it was a small meeting. And I was very obvious there in my, stethoscope hanging on my pocket. But they were very, very gracious. And I introduced myself and said I was a doctor and I was there to learn something. They all told their doctor stories. Stories about how they had deceived the doctor to get some tranquilizers or whatever. Some resentment that the doctors hadn't asked more about their own drinking or whatever. And it's true. I mean, and we call it the review of systems. There was this one question: how much do you drink? And the patient and the doctor you say 2 drinks or social drinking or whatever, and you move on. You never pursue that question. And I was amazed by their stories, especially the fact that they would lie to the doctor. My goodness, why would anyone do that? I was naive. So that began my entry into the field which we now call addiction medicine. There's a whole story there. I can't get sidetracked too much by that. I eventually went to a 2-week course at the Navy. The Navy had developed a really good program, but its origins were classified information. They were afraid that the general public might find out that there were some alcoholic sailors in their ranks, and it was amazing the secrecy around the beginning of this program. But finally, it became. Betty Ford. Where did she go for her recovery? It was the Naval Hospital in Long Beach. They didn't have the Betty Ford program. She's written an account of her getting sober, which I highly recommend, politics aside. She's a great writer, and it's a good story. But I'd gone there 2 years previously, the same hospital, for 2 weeks for health professionals. The Navy recognized we didn't know anything about alcoholism or substance abuse, and so they were trying to make some rectify the situation. And after that 2-week course, when I went back to my duty station, now Newport, Rhode Island, I knew more than anybody else did about alcoholism. And the psychiatrists had this small alcohol rehab program, but they were really interested in running that one. They were much more comfortable doing their psychiatry thing. So gradually I put my foot in, and a few years later I became the chief of the service. And that's where I learned a lot, hanging around recovering alcoholic counselors. But I'm giving another talk in a couple of months about my own personal growth, and I'll save the rest of that for then. Medical model of addiction. when I first heard that alcoholism was a disease back in the 70s, I resisted that notion mightily. Oh, come on, how can that be a disease? I think my biggest concern was that it would give the alcoholic the license to drink, so I can't help it, I got a disease. Very gradually, over years of first kind of hanging around recovering alcoholics and then getting involved in the field, I came to realize what was meant by the medical model and to embrace it fully, and how, as a physician, it actually helps me in the field, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later on. First of all, just a brief aside, years ago when I heard psychologists and so forth talking about the medical model, and some of their opposition to that, the notion, I think mostly being that the physician was some kind of hierarchical figure and the patient was this passive recipient. And I mean, no, that's the surgical model. The medical model is where, for many of us, and Todd's not here today, but in internal medicine, we're dealing with chronic, incurable conditions, hypertension, diabetes, and so forth, where usually it's an alliance between physician and patients and trying, with some education and some encouragement, to get them to do things in their life that we can't do. We can't change their diet. We can't change their lifestyle. So that kind of medical model as opposed to the surgical model. And medical model as opposed to, let's say, the moral model. Many of us, all of us, really carry inside us the feeling that, when alcoholics and drugs are using, they can do some bad things. And just because we say, this is a medical condition, that doesn't mean, therefore, they're immediately forgiven everything that they did. No, by no means. So you have this kind of moral model that we've all internalized, sitting alongside the medical model. There's also, I would say, the social, psychological or psychiatric model. And this is more of a historic model. It goes something like this. This was certainly in the 50s and the 60s after psychoanalysis and all had become fashionable. It was that people were alcoholic because something had happened to them when they were really young, some trauma or something like that. And they were drinking as a way of dealing with that trauma. So the treatment would be to go to a therapist and on the couch you have these 50-minute hours, whatever, and eventually if you could uncover and resolve this underlying past thing, then the alcoholism would just sort of disappear. Well, many people spent many hours on the couch and some got some benefit from it, but the alcoholism, for the most part, did not disappear. And I think many of us still, the popular media, Tennessee Williams plays and so forth, have this implication in them that there's some dark secret that needs to come to the surface and get exposed and dealt with, and then everybody will be happy. And then even in another model, even in medicine, there's this public health model now. The speed epidemic, I've heard recently a talk, which was looked at as if it was indeed like an infectious disease epidemic, and how can we deal with this? How can we intervene in some way or other? So there's many models. Talking about addiction is very much like the five blind men and the elephant. The arguments that these five blind men get into as they try to identify or explore what is this elephant. One man says, it's like a wall or a barn, and he's got the flank in front of him. And the other says, no, it's like a snake, and he's got the tail. And the third one says, no, it's like a column, and he's got his arms around the elephant's leg or whatever. None of them are wrong in a sense, but they don't have the larger picture, and that's what talking about addiction is like. Why all the models? That's because this is a complex, poorly understood condition. In AA, they call it cunning, baffling, and powerful, and I agree 100% with that. medical model implies disease, and I know there's some resistance to the disease model, and again, like I said earlier, my own resistance to that. As I said before, I believe it is a disease, and I would like to recruit science to bolster the support for that. I don't mean that people who, therapists in particular, who have grown up with the psychological model or that they're wrong. I would think of it more as what I'm about to tell you about the medical model is that maybe there's a new foundation to the house, and the kitchen is still next to the dining room, and things look pretty much the way they did, but there's been a subtle change, and that maybe that leak in the basement doesn't occur anymore when this understanding of a larger model. Here's a definition that I want to read, and I'm going to read it twice to explain a couple of the words. This comes from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which I'm a member of, physicians, largely organization. A primary chronic disease with genetic, psychosocial, and environmental factors influencing its development and manifestations. The disease is often progressive and fatal. It is characterized by continuous or periodic impaired control over drinking, preoccupation with the drug alcohol, use of alcohol despite adverse consequences, and distortions in thinking, most notably denial. For a moment, let me say that they're talking about alcoholism, but I would like to enlarge and include drugs, particularly heroin, cocaine, but also drugs like nicotine. We've thought for many years that nicotine smoking was a bad habit, and why is it so difficult for people to stop this habit when trying to get people to stop smoking? Well, the minute I understood that it was an addiction, suddenly it became very easy to understand why it is so difficult for people to stop smoking. So, not only drugs and alcohol, but even what we call the process addictions. Gambling is the best studied of these. But Paul next week is going to talk about sex addiction, food. I believe that both sex and food can be addicting using this model. But this is a controversial area, and it's the jury's still out medically as to you will not find sex addiction in the psychiatric Bible, the DSM-3, which I'll mention in a minute. So let's go back to this definition again. A primary chronic disease. What do you mean by primary? This is not secondary to something else. The previous psychiatric notion that your addiction was due to something that had happened in the past, or you can enlarge it, due to our materialistic society, people become addicted. This is what we mean by secondary. Not the case. The belief in the medical model is that this is a primary condition in and of itself, like hypertension or diabetes. A primary chronic disease with genetic, psychosocial, and environmental factors. I'm going to focus on the genetic part of it because this, I think, is often overlooked. We'll come back to that later. The disease is often progressive, is characterized by continuous or periodic impaired control. I think much more common, it's in periodic impaired control. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And finally, it is characterized by use of alcohol despite adverse consequences. I think that's a really good, if you're not sure if something is an addiction or not, is this something that has happened, like let's say shopping is sometimes called or talked about as an addiction. Now, if you continue to shop after you've run up your credit card bills, been arrested for shoplifting, and been humiliated by the security people at Macy's or whatever, and you continue to do it, that would weigh in that this maybe is something like an addiction. Addiction is often used as a metaphor for something you like to do. And I would like to narrow the focus down. At least this is what the medical model would say. I mentioned earlier, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of, what's the rest of it? It's the Bible of Psychiatric Diagnoses. And in this handout I've taken from the last page of it is the most concise definition by their standards of substance use disorders. And there's like a little bit of a Chinese menu. You have 3 of the following or more, and there's a number of things. And you take your favorite, whatever it is, and see if that can fit in. You can make a diagnosis of your own turn on. So back to this disease concept, or the medical model. I'm a physician, so this is, of course, something that suits me. I'm always mindful of the fact that, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So my bias could be, I'm a physician, so all this looks like a disease. I'm aware of that limiting view. And I think it's best compared with not a strep throat kind of disease, but the incurable chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, lymphoma. One morning I had a morning report up at the hospital at Kaiser, and they were presenting somebody's history of lymphoma and how the diagnosis had been made some years before. They'd had their chemotherapy. They were in remission, and then some years later, the lymphoma came back, and this time they had to have a bone marrow transplant or whatever. And finally they achieved another remission, and then a few years later, some other, like a leukemia came on that was not unrelated to the original, but was a different manifestation of it. And I'm thinking, that sounds like some of our patients that may achieve a remission from their alcoholism and do well, and years later they come down with a cocaine problem, and then they beat that, and then a few years later, now they've got chronic pain and they're hooked on opiates. Same sort of thing. And you don't ask, what is your cure rate in alcohol? I sometimes get that. What's your cure rate with alcoholics? Well, I would go back and say, what's your cure rate with your diabetics? It isn't, that's not where the interest is. I don't think we don't have a cure. AA, I think it's in the big book, talks about alcoholism as like an allergy. And very early on, they got it. They knew that this was a condition in which drinking was different for the alcoholic than it was for the person next door. It's not an allergy, strictly speaking, but it's not a bad metaphor, I think, for this model. That's all I want to say about various models. Comments or questions, briefly, kind of a pause on it. People seem to be interested in what I'm saying. I was concerned that I'd be putting it to sleep, but Clint.
Well, I just have a question. Like, for instance, it seems like there's an increase, and maybe it's just become more public than before, but from reading about it and hearing about it, it's like with the crystal meth addictiveness seems to just be sweeping this country. And I'm just thinking, I would think that the percentage of people who are prone to addiction would probably be the same in any given period of time. So why are we having, if we are having more addictive behavior, is it because of society? Is it like more the environmental aspect of addiction rather than like the genetic or predisposition to it?
Well, it's a good question. I think your first pass at it, that we're more open about these sort of things. Certainly, there were various addictions, in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, I understand that colonial life in America was rife with alcoholism. That this is not new. And when the Katharine Hepburn character in Long Day's Journey into Night, she's addicted to laudanum, which was a liquid opiate thing. This was not uncommon at that period of time, but people didn't talk about it. If you see Long Day's Journey into Night, they know what's going on, but nobody talks about it. So, has somebody done a comparison study in prevalence of addiction in 1910 versus prevalence of addiction currently? I don't know, and it would be very difficult to do. I think we've come through the 60s when drug use was popular, was in. That permissiveness, I think, may explain for it more than the actual frequency of the condition and the variety of it. Before it was mostly alcohol. Cocaine, cocaine's been around for a long time. It was the ingredient in Coca-Cola. So, good question. Hard to answer.
I'm just wondering what the difference is. I mean, I know the term functional alcoholic, and I'm acquainted with several. To me, it seems like, they're not like missing work, they're not, they've got all the normal elements of life, but they're drinking a lot.
I think that impaired control, periodic impaired control, they've got it, quote, under control. They may be drinking a lot, but it isn't so much out of control that they can't go to work. We'll talk a little bit more about that.
If it's a physical, if there's a physical base as a medical disease, what is the physical nature of it, of the addiction? Is it like a blood sugar thing?
Coming up.
Okay.
I want to offer another definition, not mine, that I think connects with Buddhism from Gregory and Mary Catherine Bateson. Mary Catherine is the daughter of himself and Margaret Mead, and they're anthropologists and philosophers. And so the definition is it's a systems definition that addiction is when, instead of getting negative feedback that is becoming satiated by something like eating, I feel full, I don't want any more, that addiction is when you do it, you want more of it. So the alcoholic, and this fits in with AA, the alcoholic takes the first drink and then that isn't okay, like fine. They want more drinks. And I think it connects with Buddhism, both as in general it's in my mind, and Thich Nhat Hanh talks about watering the seeds that are within us, that all the seeds are always there. And so when we take a drink, we water the seeds or use another substance, and it tends to increase. So the question then, of course, is how do you stop watering the seeds?
This is a great intro into what I'm about to talk about. And they were using metaphors then, I think, because I think they had the right idea, but they didn't have the science to
well, the mechanism that underlies that.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so if this is a disease, what do we know about it? And I again mentioned this as a concise and readable account of that. First of all, in the last 20, 25 years, we've learned a lot. And I've been doing this. So when I started off in the early 70s, I didn't know any of this stuff that we know now. One thing we did know that there was something about families. This disease ran in families. And of course the big thing was, is this genetic or is this environmental? Do people grow up learning how to drink because their parents drank? And you do all the studies, and identical twins that were separated at birth, and you think, well, how likely is that? How many people know a set of identical twins? Somebody who usually get more hands, but it's not uncommon. And of course, the research was done initially that showed that for men, indeed, there was something genetic as opposed to environmental exposure. The studies were done. This surprised people because they really didn't think this was the age of behaviorism and so forth. So they did the studies over and over again. And in Scandinavia had really good studies because they had better adoption records and so forth. And again, men clearly, women maybe not so clearly, but yes, this is true for women as well. But it appears more that men are more, it's either simpler or easier, the genetic aspect for men. Well, not satisfied with that, they did the animal studies, and the mouse or the rat was the favorite laboratory animal. most mice, if you put them in a cage, you got a water bottle and a bottle spiked with vodka. Most mice, taste both of them, but they don't want the vodka. They'll get their water from the water bottle. Now you can put sugar in the vodka bottle, and they'll drink it, but they're going for the sugar. You can stress them by, pinching their tails. Oddly enough, that's one of the mouse stressors, is having their tails pinched, and they will drink then the vodka. But every so often you'll find that there's a mouse that goes for the vodka, and that's called an alcohol-preferring mouse. Well, identify an alcohol-preferring female mouse, an alcohol-preferring male mouse. Take all the alcohol away. All they've got now is just water. Have them mate and test the offspring. And that's not 100%, but you have a higher prevalence of this relatively uncommon condition in mice, where they drink, and they will drink alcoholically. They will drink beyond what it would take to feel good. You kind of roll over in their cages and so forth. And we've known that for years. This is not new. So, all you really need to do is just breed these mice, and you'll get a certain number of them that are, quote, alcoholic. Well, modern DNA stuff is trying to zero in on this, and every so often you'll see an article, alcoholism gene identified. Well, then, a year or so later you don't hear anything more about that, because it either didn't turn out, or that's only part of the picture. And what it's looking like, this is really complex. It's not one gene. I don't even think it's going to be 10 genes. This is going to be a complex thing. But it's got its basis in genetics. Now, if there's some genetic defect here, where is it? Now, we know that there's, for instance, Navajo Indians metabolize alcohol at a slightly different rate than the Irish. No, maybe not the Irish. Anyways, that doesn't account for alcoholism. Yeah, because they metabolize it a little bit differently. That isn't it. What we're learning is there's something going on in the brain here, and the wiring of the brain. Let me go back again to something we knew years ago. It was kind of a medical curiosity. There was an area in the brain that if you, with a little tiny wire, could slip that wire in the brain in exactly the right spot and give a tiny electrical impulse. This is a picture here of a rat with one of these cables in its brain. My partner said I shouldn't show this because, let me pass it around. He's got the cable in the head, and he's got his paw on this little lever. Whenever he would press the lever, he'd get a little bit of jolt in that one particular area. And the mouse would press that lever like crazy. And it was called the pleasure center because they didn't know what else it was. And I thought, that was kind of curious. If you got the wire, a fraction of a millimeter away, well, it wouldn't do it. And I think that bit of research just sat there, on the shelf for years until imaging studies came along with computers and fancy technology. You can put somebody in like an MRI machine nowadays, and you can ask them, do the multiplication table in your head. And in a certain area of the brain will light up, and they'll say, well, that's got something to do with mental arithmetic. Or you can show a cocaine addict a picture of salt, let's say a pile of salt. But their brain will light up in this area that the next person who's not a cocaine addict, you show a picture of salt, that area doesn't light up. But, and you can't do too much in these MRI machines because you got your head in there. If anybody's had an MRI or a CAT scan, you're not going to be able to study sexual activity very well. But I think sooner or later this is going to happen. Somehow or other we're going to learn what happens when you do X or Y and see what happens in the brain. The pictures of white powder, or you can slip some alcohol intravenously in them. we're getting some image, some idea of what's going on in the brain that we had no idea of before. And it turns out this sort of pleasure center lights up when the cocaine addict sees this picture of white salt. It's exactly the same spot. And it turns out it's more complicated than one little area. And what we've done, we call, instead of the pleasure center, we're calling this the reward system. And it's deep in the brain. They call it the reptile part of the brain. This is not the cerebral cortex that makes us so different than snakes, but it's there in the basic breathing and sexual functioning of how the organism survives and reproduces. Now, this is speculation, but we think that the reason that we have something there that is so-called the reward system. Well, let me first, the net effect of stimulating the reward system is, in essence, do it again. That's the way I look at it. This is, now, we can say, oh, that feels good. I want to do it again. A friend of mine years ago tried freebase cocaine for the first time, back in the 80s. This was the predecessor to crack cocaine, where you immediately get this, by smoking it, you get this surge of the cocaine. And seconds into the experience, he said, I wanted to do it again. He hadn't even finished or even begun to appreciate what was going on, but he knew he wanted to do it again. And cocaine is a really good example of one of these drugs that sets off the reward system. It was during the cocaine epidemic of the 80s that we began learning this stuff, because we didn't have any tools in how to deal with cocaine. We kind of knew how to treat alcoholism, but cocaine was new at the time. So a lot of government money was spent doing research, trying to understand cocaine, or come up with something that would block the cocaine high or whatever. So cocaine was a good way of studying this thing, and this reward system. I did cocaine once, and it didn't do very much. I know that's nice, but patients told me a story once. He and his wife had never done cocaine. Again, this is back in the late 80s or so, and they wanted to try some, and the husband said, I know I can get some. So he brings it home one night, and they each do a couple lines of cocaine. After a few minutes, the wife says, oh, that's nice. Let's save the rest for the weekend. And he says, are you kidding? And he snorts up the rest of the cocaine. Now, these people are having two different responses to the cocaine. Now, they're both like it in a sense. But, one is kind of casual and, what are we going to have for dinner? And the other has just been consumed by the fact that something very powerful is going on. And I think that's a good... Now, you could say, well, there are all kinds of explanations for that. There's one man, male, female, and so forth. But I think it's a nice kind of illustration of how different people can be affected by the same substance in the same setting. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is because his reward system is genetically engineered a little bit different than hers. So the reward system, as I said, it's part of that primitive part of the brain. It's got lots of connections to different areas of the brain, and one of them is memory, and that's the second part. So we have the reward system. The second part is memory. Now, conditioning is a form of memory. Pavlov's dog, whenever you ring the bell, you give him a piece of meat, and after a while you just ring the bell, and the dog is salivating. Cocaine is a great reinforcer. If you used to always do your cocaine with Freddie, and then one day you run into Freddie, out of the context, the immediate sort of, oh, you got any cocaine on you? Because the associations get linked very strongly. One patient would describe driving a 101 into the city, and he would get off at Potrero Hill because that's where his dealer was. Well, even months into recovery, he's driving up 101, he sees a Potrero Hill exit, and if he's not mindful, he's going to be exiting that, before he's even aware of what he's doing, because the strong associations that are. I see people nodding. And so why the memory? I wouldn't guess necessarily that memory is really, really important in this. But if you go back to why do we have the reward system? And as I said, I'm going to take a chance that the reward system is there to reinforce any behavior that is really necessary either for survival of the individual, i.e. eating, or reproduction, sex. And that this is a way of getting the organism to do again something that's vital for these two functions. And I think our current thinking is that addiction is where something goes wrong with this system that's already built into us. And it gives, cocaine is described as hijacking the reward system for purposes of its own. Another thing about memory is vivid recall. And I will ask patients, do you remember your first drink? And I don't remember my first drink. But more often, more than I would have thought, somebody would say, oh yeah, it was Friday afternoon and Johnny Campbell and I broke into his dad's liquor cabinet and we got roaring drunk and sick, and this vivid memory of their first drink, which also involved getting drunk, going straight to, no limit. Not true for everyone, not true for every alcoholic, but not an uncommon experience. So again, memory. Years into recovery, people can still, cigarette smokers, the smell of somebody's cigarette, you've given up cigarettes, but that the craving can be linked with that, and if you've got a good program, you can get over it, but don't underestimate the importance of memory. Now, so we have these two things, the reward system and memory, pushing the organism to doing it, do it again. And on the opposing side, we have the frontal cortex. Now, this is the part of the brain that is indeed, developed in humans. This is our thinking area, and the frontal lobe part is called the executive part of the brain. This is where judgments and decision making and weighing one thing against the other. And this is where what we call inhibitory control resides. By inhibitory control, I'll give the example. If you see these great plasma TVs at Circuit City or whatever, and you just put it on your credit card. We'll take one home today. Well, inhibitory control says, now wait a minute, your credit card's already maxed out. They're nice, but if you wait a little bit longer, the price will come down. That's executive functioning going on. What we've also recently learned is this executive functioning going on is not complete until maybe even the early 20s, that children and adolescents do not have a ready-formed, fully functioning brain when they're born. We thought that was the case, during gestation and maturing of the embryo and so forth, you came out with this finished brain. It's still growing into the early 20s. And no surprise that for many people, addiction starts off in their adolescent years, where this inhibitory control isn't fully developed. And the question came, well, about this functioning alcoholic. I'll give you a story of a guy who, when he was retired, and he and his wife liked to go on road trips, stay at motels, eat at restaurants, go around the country. When he was on these road trips, he could drink wine, but it didn't get out of control. He was the driver. He was with his wife. She was keeping an eye on things. But once he got home, and particularly if she went off to visit her sister for a few days, his drinking would get out of control every time. She'd come home disgusted. She would know this would happen. But he had some degree of control. May have been external effect. His wife's right there. He's got to do the driving and so forth. But he gets home where he doesn't have these obligations. Work, having to go to work for many, particularly men, is a stabilizer of their drinking. You know, you drink Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday, but they can rein it in Sunday evening and get it together so they can go to work on Monday morning. And so this would be a functional alcoholic. But you know, sometimes you never know when it's going to get out of control. And that can be, you know, they can get away with this heavy drinking. Now their wife is upset with them, the doctors have told them, they've been through a treatment program, but there are going to be long stretches of time where they can get away with it. And then something happens, and this loss of control, which we don't understand really well, can occur again. So that's, to answer Lee's question, kind of what we know now about this, what we think is maybe genetically impaired. It could be the inhibitory control in some people, for genetic reasons, isn't ever going to be as well tuned. I know some people, chronic marijuana smokers, who work in the computer industry, and they can. This guy's had a series of consequences. It's an amusing story, but I can't tell it now. And he can function for years. But there will be a time when something happens and when it's least predictable. Let me switch to treatment or recovery. And as I said, the science here, I mistrust a fair bit of the pharmaceutical research, for good reason. There's now 3, possibly 4 drugs that have been approved by the FDA for the treatment of one sort or another of addiction. And these are done as a population statistical thing, and there's a patient, drug X tested in 5,000 people, showed they had a statistically decreased number of reoccurrences of their drinking compared to the group that got the placebo. This is not, dramatically different between these two groups. It's statistical and repeated over and over again. And I'm willing to prescribe some of these antabuse, for instance, for alcohol. And there's a new one, a camprosate for alcohol. But I'm not real enthusiastic about it. As I said, I'll prescribe them. But we don't have a pharmaceutical, miracle drug. And I don't know that we ever will. For us in the treatment business, recovery is basically making a diagnosis. Most of the time when the patients get to us at Kaiser at the treatment program, the jig is up. Okay, I know I've got a problem. I'm here. Sometimes people are forced there. A Muni driver gets caught after an accident with a positive cocaine in their urine. They're sent for treatment. They don't agree. They got the right to use cocaine, but their job has sent them to treatment. Until they get to the point where they say, all right, yeah, I do have a problem, for me in a sense, making a diagnosis. They're going to sit there in treatment, but they're going to go back and they're going to continue to use so long as they don't get caught getting away with it. So the first step would be making a diagnosis. And for 12 steps, the first step is admitted we were powerless. I think it's analogous that making a diagnosis or admitting we were powerless, with some recognition that I have this condition. The second thing that we do at Kaiser is education. Basically what we've done this morning, this sort of thing, lots of education. We're not basically doing treatment or psychotherapy. Some people will need that, absolutely. But it's like learning to play an instrument, like a guitar. Most of early recovery, particularly those early weeks, is practice. And it's don't drink, go to meetings, ask for help. Very simple. Practice that over and over and over again. And, this illness, if you buy what I'm saying, does not affect the cortex of the brain again. So it's trying to think your way through this isn't going to work. I've tried to play a guitar, and it's very awkward. It doesn't feel right. But if you practice over and over and over again, I know it is possible to very quickly, move your fingers up and down and produce music. So for us, early recovery is a training kind of program. And there's some links with Buddhism there. It isn't until the 11th step in the 12-step program that meditation is brought in. The 12th step, and I really do believe the steps are meant to be done in order. I've heard people say, well, I'll do a little bit of 9th step, then I'll do some 2nd step. Right? No, I really think they're meant to be done in order. The 12th step talks about a spiritual awakening. Okay, I'm out of time. I'm afraid we're also, I wisely left no time for questions. There's 2 books here that are both making 12 steps on Buddha's path. Bill W., Buddha, and we. This is a spiritual journey of recovery. And this was one breath at a time, Buddhism and the 12 steps. I'll let you glance at these if you're interested. So, thank you very much for your attention. Sorry to run over.
So, no questions. So we'll ask for announcements. Hey.
I'm the host this morning, and we'll have a refreshment after the closing of the program part. Please enjoy the refreshment, but if you use teacups, please wash them and put them back to the rack. And we also have a dana bowl up there, and suggested donation amount is $5 to $8, but we'll happily accept anything more, and so you decide based on your willingness and ability how much you want to put. But we certainly appreciate your contribution. And we also have a sign-up sheet for new members. If you'd like to receive our newsletter, please leave your email address and street address, and we'll stay in touch with you. And finally, there usually is a group of people who go out to have lunch together. If you're interested in that, please let me know, and I'll find those people for you. Thank you.
Don?
First of all, I have a bunch, not too many, those are sometimes how many we get, about 30 letters from prisoners to us, which need to be opened and classified. When I say classified, we do some are first letters, some are correspondence, etc. So we need to read them all and sort of figure out what to do with them. And there's a system for it, because there are volunteers who Robin and Doug Hall do things with the letters. But I do need help today at the little party. I brought letter openers. If we could sit for about 10 minutes, I think that's all it usually takes, outside, after we've all had our coffee or tea. So I appreciate that for the letter opening morning. And the other is, I've been doing this for 9, 10 years, and I want some help from somebody to help me with, or to help the program. So I'd like, if there's anybody that would like to think about how they could help. I think it's not a terribly onerous job, but I have reasons for why I think I might not, in the next little while, continue with it. So I'd very much like to have people just read the letters. It's a great experience.
So we're looking for a volunteer for the prisoner letter program. We're also looking for a volunteer to check the mail every week and forward it to the right people. There's a mailbox that's in the Castro. I'm moving to the East Bay, so we need someone else who will be in the Castro weekly. And you can talk to me about that. I've got a list of the different tasks in that job. Other announcements? CJ?
Yes, I'm the potluck coordinator, and there is a potluck planned for June 11th at Kay's Place in Berkeley. And I believe at the end of July, possibly July 30.
Yes.
At Lee's on 17th Street. So, if anybody wants to consider a potluck, speak with me.
Ray?
I have an updated list for the GDF directory from last week. If your name is not on it and you want it to be, there's a blank sheet you can sign up on. If you want to check your name and make sure the information is correct, it'll be on the desk just to the left of the exit.
And I'd like to remind people that Community Thrift at 623 Valencia near 17th Street accepts donations, and when you leave things there for resale, you specify that you want the proceeds to go to GBF, and that's the source of income for this organization.
As much as $1,000 a year sometimes.
Not lately, but has been. Okay.
I'd just like to know if anybody's here for the first time or who's being here for the first time after a long period of absence.
A couple of you. Or returns. Shall we stand in a circle and hold hands, and Peter will do the offering of prayer?
By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, and live believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.